Now, there's going to be a lot of fanfare when Biden makes a big deal about signing this bogus Inflation Reduction Act into law next week. But Biden actually had the opportunity to do something very simple that really would have brought down costs for a lot of people in America. And he decided for political reasons not to do it. Now, this is not a news story. I meant to talk about this before, but just other things have come up that have preempted it. But 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was talk that Biden was considering a temporary waiver of the Jones Act, not to permanently repeal it, which would be even better, but at least temporarily waive it, given the fact that inflation was such a big problem and Biden was trying to do everything he could to lower costs for the American public. Now, of course, he doesn't want to cut government spending, perish the thought, and really reduce inflation. But one thing Biden can do is get rid of some unnecessary government regulation that is artificially making costs so much higher, particularly transportation costs. And what Biden could have done, at least temporarily, to ease the pain would be to temporarily repeal the Jones Act, which artificially increases the cost of transporting everything, including energy, throughout the United States. So that would have been major relief for a lot of businesses, and all of that would have been passed on to consumers. So why didn't Joe Biden take advantage of that opportunity and this crisis to at least temporarily relieve the American public of the burden of having to pay for the Jones Act on top of having to pay for the higher cost of everything else? And it comes down to politics. And this is not just about Joe Biden. I called out President Trump when he too was considering a waiver of the Jones Act. This was for Puerto Rico, and it was in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. The island really needed a lot of stuff fast. And of course, there weren't enough Jones Act ships available to bring stuff to the island. And so Trump was about to issue a waiver to allow any ship to help out in the crisis. But in the last minute, he was talked out of it, or rather pressured out of it, by members of Congress that had been bought and paid for by the narrow group of people who benefit from the Jones Act. And to protect this narrow special interest, President Trump, against his better judgment, he was ready to temporarily waive this act, but he caved based on the political pressure, which was very unfortunate because Donald Trump ran for office to drain the swamp. Well, the Jones Act, that's the creature from the Black Lagoon. That is the swamp. And not only was President Trump unwilling to kill this swamp monster, he wouldn't even give it a timeout. Now, a lot of people may not be familiar with the Jones Act or understand exactly why it drives up shipping costs so much. So I'll give you the Cliff Note version of this act. And basically what it does is it requires that any goods that are transported between two American ports, number one, they have to be transported on ships that were built in America. And there's not that many ships that were in fact built in America because of how expensive it is to build them here. And the ships have to be crewed by American workers. And there's not that many American workers who are crewing ships because of the cost of employing Americans to work on ships relative to the cost of employing foreigners. That's why when you go on a cruise ship and you see all these people working on these ships, even if they're American companies, the ships are not flagged in America, and hardly any of the people who are working on these ships are Americans. But getting back to the Jones Act itself, there are several ways that this act artificially increases transportation costs. Number one, a lot of goods that get transported up and down the West and East Coast, a lot of those goods might otherwise be transported by water, but they're not, because of the requirement to use Jones Act vessels artificially increases the cost of using ships versus using trucks or rail. And so what happens is a lot of goods that might have been transported on the water end up being transported on the highways in trucks. And not only does this increase the cost of transportation, but it's not as good for the environment. because there's a lot more emissions when you're using all these trucks as opposed to a ship. And in aggregate, all those individual trucks are going to end up using a lot more oil than would one ship that was carrying all this cargo. So not only would ending the Jones Act make transportation less expensive, but it would also make it a whole lot greener. So if Biden wants to do something about this supposed systemic threat of climate change, and he wants to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, he would not only just temporarily repeal the Jones Act, but he would permanently abolish it. Of course, there are some parts of America that bear a disproportionate burden from the Jones Act. And those would be people living on islands, like people living in Hawaii or people living in Puerto Rico. And that's because, let's say you've got a ship that's en route to California from Asia. That ship can't stop in Hawaii along the way, drop some stuff off, and then continue on to California. What it ends up doing is, even though it has goods that would be bound for Hawaii, it doesn't stop in Hawaii. It goes all the way through to California, and then it unloads the goods that need to go to Hawaii in California. Now, those goods have to be reloaded on a Jones Act ship, where you have an American-built ship with an American crew, and now they have to be shipped all the way back to Hawaii. It obviously would have been much cheaper if that ship could have just dropped off that stuff in Hawaii. But if it stopped in Hawaii first, it couldn't continue on to California. It'd have to go back because it can't travel between two U.S. ports. So everybody in Hawaii has to suffer. Now, it's even worse, I think, in Puerto Rico, because the per capita income in Puerto Rico is a lot lower. So ships that are bound for the East Coast can't stop in Puerto Rico. Instead, the goods have to be loaded off the ship on the East Coast, then reloaded onto a Jones Act ship, and then they have to be sent back to Puerto Rico. So just about everybody suffers from the Jones Act, but just some people suffer more than others. But the only people who gain are the owners and operators of this small fleet of Jones Act ships. They make a fortune, and therein lies the problem. I'm going to illustrate this problem with an example, but I'm totally making up these numbers because I don't know what the exact numbers are for the Jones Act, or how many people benefit, or exactly how much they make. I'm sure I could figure it out, but I don't have the time to do all the research. So I'm going to use a hypothetical example. Let's say you have 10 wealthy people who collectively make $1 billion a year off of a particular law that's been passed. But let's say that same law causes the American public in general to spend an extra $100 billion a year. So the benefit to a narrow group of people is $1 billion, but the cost to a broader group of people is $100 billion. So the cost is 100 times the benefit. So from a purely economic perspective, there is no reason for that law. But from a political perspective, there is every reason for that law. And that's because the 10 people who make $100 million apiece have a big vested interest in making sure that law stays on the books. And they're willing to share their windfall with any politicians who are willing to make sure that that happens. So if I'm making $100 million and the cost of keeping that is maybe $10 million a year in political bribes, well, I'm still left with $90 million. So if I got to cut the government in for 10% of my take, I'm willing to do it. And so these politicians realize that they can get a lot of money for their campaigns if they help these people maintain this windfall. On the other hand, what's the political advantage to looking out for the 300 million Americans that are unnecessarily paying an extra $100 billion in costs? Because on a per person basis, you're talking about maybe $30 a year. So if I'm promising to save a taxpayer $30, how much is that worth? How much money is he going to contribute to my campaign to save $30 if I can even convince him that he's going to save it? Because most American voters have no idea how the Jones Act hurts them. And what politician wants to spend the energy to try to educate them to maybe get a couple of bucks in contributions? Whereas the people who benefit huge from the Jones Act, they know exactly how much they make, and they don't have to be convinced of anything. They're going to bribe any politician big bucks to preserve that perk. And so that's what's happening. That's why Trump wouldn't temporarily repeal it. That's why Biden wouldn't do it, because even a temporary repeal opens the door to something permanent. And that's why this small group of people who derive an enormous benefit from the continuation of the Jones Act will not even allow so much as a waiver, even during emergency, as was the case in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Take a look at the example we just had with the provision to substantially limit the carried interest deduction stricken from the Inflation Reduction Act. How did that happen? Kyrsten Sinema demanded that as a condition of her support, that tax on rich hedge fund and private equity managers be removed from the bill, and it was removed. Why? Because there's a small group of very wealthy people that derive an enormous benefit from that loophole, and they're certainly willing to share their windfall with any politician who is willing to protect it. And so now you have a lot of very rich people who owe a tremendous debt to Kyrsten Sinema, and I'm sure she's going to collect. Now, there's a lot of people out there that would probably jump to the wrong conclusion and blame the private sector for this. They would say, see, these are these greedy capitalists trying to get extra money and they're bribing politicians. This has got nothing to do with capitalism. If it was capitalism, businesses wouldn't be able to earn money by bribing politicians. They would have to earn money by providing their customers with higher quality, lower cost goods. The Jones Act is not a part of capitalism. It's a part of socialism. The problem is the government. It's not that private industry is lobbying to have government power used for its benefit. The problem is that government has the ability to sell that power in the first place. That is the problem. You've got to take the power away from government. And if the government can't dole out favors, then nobody's going to be lobbying the government to have the favors doled out for them when there's nothing to dole out in the first place.